Yeah. Okay. Well, it's 9:15. Is that when we start? No?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay.
So I really don't believe Pastor Ken needs any kind of introduction, but I can say something. Not very well, but in the process of looking at evangelism and those kinds of, because it seems like that term has been co-opted by a lot of different things to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So in the discussion, we thought we would ask somebody who has spent a fair amount of time dealing with that term on both a professional and on a personal level.
Yep, it did it.
So without any further ado, allow me to share someone whom you know and appreciate, Pastor Ken.
Thank you. There is a handout that if you're here in the building, you can pick up at the back as you come in. And I'll just go through this on using the word evangelism or evangelical to describe our faith. This was a topic that came up in the Adult Learning Committee, and so we worked on this a little bit, decided to have a session really focused on evangelical in the New Testament, and that's not the area that I'm covering, that we already had. But I wanted to go over the use of the word evangelical over the last few hundred years and how that's changed and the problems and possibilities that that presents for us. In the 16th century was the Lutheran Reformation, and the Lutheran Reformation really made extensive use of the word evangelical to describe itself and to describe its congregations. It preferred in many ways to use the word evangelical rather than the word Lutheran or the word Protestant. Now you can see almost right off the bat why they would prefer to use a word like evangelical rather than Protestant or Lutheran. The word evangelical means good news, to hear the good news of the scripture, the Bible, that Jesus Christ has come into the world and God is with us, and through Jesus's presence, we experience salvation and restoration and ultimate reunion with God. Jesus died on the cross to save us from our sins. That's the evangelical message. And by describing themselves as evangelical, they were using a new word, grounding themselves in scripture, making sure that they were focused on Christ and the good news that is presented. If you start to use the word Protestant to describe yourself, then you're into a little bit different view of things, where you're the one who is protesting whatever is going on, and that focuses attention on the antagonism, the conflict, the argument. And although that may be helpful, that isn't really what you would want in the end. You'd really want a word like evangelical. And Lutheran has its own problems too, and Luther didn't like it very much because it focuses on a person rather than God's work. And so it would be better to call yourself evangelical rather than Lutheran or Protestant. But those who are part of a movement do not necessarily get to pick the words that are used to describe them. Like we are called, as Americans, we are called Yankees because of the name that was given to us by the British Empire in the Revolution. And eventually we learned to live with that word Yankee, like we've learned to live with the words Lutheran and Protestant, and they're okay. But you don't get to choose as a movement the words that ultimately describe you. So consequently, evangelical is a deep part of our history as a movement. And you'll see this in the names of many congregations. I grew up in Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church, and I served one church it was called First Evangelical Lutheran Church. And many times you'll run across the word evangelical embedded into the constitution of a congregation or its name, or you'll see evangelical embedded in the constitutions of our synod or our church-wide structure. So it's a word that we have a legacy with, and it's an important word for us. But I want to get to the second part of our outline here, and that is that over the centuries, additional layers of meaning have been added to the word. So you have this word from the 16th century, and then the centuries pass by, things happen, and the word starts to accrue more meanings along the way, some of which we really were happy with, and some of them we weren't particularly happy with, and some of them we were originally happy with but changed our mind. One of the things that happened was that the New World was discovered, and in the 16th, 17th, and 17th century, really, and 18th century, this meant that there were whole new possibilities for sharing the gospel with those who had never heard it before in North America and South America. And so there was the great missionary movement, which was described as an evangelical effort or as evangelism. And slowly it became part of the meaning of the term evangelical or evangelism to support missionaries who would go to other countries to convert people to Christianity. And that is part of our legacy and history, and it's part of the history of the word. And so there were a great many missionary efforts and societies that existed many times for 200 years or more, bringing the gospel to native cultures. And that's part of the heritage of the word evangelical and our evangelistic efforts. Now, a lot could be said about that, good and bad. There were a lot of good intentions with that. There were a lot of side things that were not particularly good, and many things that were absolutely horrible. So there has been a revisionist effort in this whole area of things, which we can get into if you want to later on. But eventually, I think global mission now is actually more conceived as an engagement with indigenous cultures in a variety of contexts to accomplish the good as it's defined by local peoples, and the assistance of people in accomplishing what they think is important is essentially what global mission is more focused on today. But that heritage just is part of the whole evangelism thing. And it makes us sometimes wonder whether it's the best word to use to describe ourselves at this particular time. Part of the evangelical movement was the colonial movement and the use of European countries in expanding and building and constructing empires with colonies in other parts of the world. And since the church, for most of these centuries, was an established state church, this colonial missional effort was actually something that was deeply attached to, I would say, the various political, choosing my words carefully here, various political agendas of European countries. And so that is sort of interwoven in this word evangelism as well. But there is something else that is happening alongside of that that also is another layer of meaning to the word evangelical. And that is the growth of piety and disestablished religion in Europe in the 17th and 18th century. Now, a lot of the Protestant movement, not necessarily in Germany, but in, let's say, France, the French Huguenots were, actually, there's some Huguenot blood in me. If you were a French Huguenot, you were automatically disengaged from the state, and the state religion was Roman Catholic, and you were really Protestant and substantially persecuted. And so your vision of the church was something that was separate from the state. You didn't want the state to be the arbiter of your religious faith. Now, many of our initial immigrants to this country are from have that kind of background to them. And so deeply embedded in our American culture is this idea that church and state are disassociated from each other, and that it's not a good idea to have an established religion like Lutheran and Roman Catholic are the established religions in Germany. The Anglican Church is the Church of England and all of that. For us, it's more the church and the state should remain independent from each other. That has its own whole set of things that we could talk about as well. But this affects the word evangelical because many of the groups that were defining themselves as evangelical came to use the word to describe a faith that was more personal than state established. And in my background, there is something called, and there may be in yours too, the evangelical free tradition, and to be evangelical free meant that you were conservative, Protestant, Christian, studied the Bible, all that sort of thing, but you really hated the idea of church hierarchy, any association with bureaucracy. Bishops were disgusting, and everything should be on a congregational level. And you just made sure that everything was based in the heart of the believer, as close to the heart of the believer as possible. And that's part of that heritage of the term that comes from the Protestant tradition that is not in the established church areas, but where the Protestant faith was in the extreme minority and persecuted. And remember, some of that persecution was precisely the reason why people immigrated to America. They wanted to escape that. So those are a couple of layers of meaning that are brought to this word evangelism and evangelical. But there's something else here too, and that is that whole pious movement that we were talking about eventually brought another layer of meaning to the word evangelical a couple of centuries ago, and up until I would say probably the 50s and the great crusades of Billy Graham, winning souls for Christ through personal conversion by means of the evangelical movement. And I bet in this room we know some of those hymns, like just as I am without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and it was thy and thou and all of that. And living for Jesus, a life that is true, striving to please him in all that I do. And life is like a mountain railroad from the cradle to the grave. We must make the run. I messed that up. Oh, life is like a mountain railroad with an engineer that's brave. We must make the run successful from the cradle to the grave. Watch the curves, the fields, the tunnels. I love to tell the story of unseen things above. all those hymns and piety are really embedded in the evangelical movement, which saw salvation as the redemption of the individual soul from the gates of hell by the salvific blood of Christ, who died on the cross to save us from our sins so that we all could go to heaven. And that was the understanding of the church. This understanding of evangelical grew in America quite profoundly. It was aided at first by radio and then television. And it probably became, because of those two things, the mass understanding of the word. And so now if you talk about evangelical or evangelism, you would be talking about that particular Christian tradition rather than something that is Lutheran. Within that area, another layer was added to the word evangelical, and that was perhaps from the 1960s on, an effort to establish a conservative cultural and political agenda. And you can sense this in your own life too. There was a time, when you could listen to a Billy Graham crusade and never hear a thing about a political agenda or anything. You were really focused on saving souls, winning souls for Christ, and that was the real focus. In the 60s and 70s, within that tradition, there was a shift that we were not only involved in saving souls for Christ, but we were involved in working to create a Christian culture which reflected our values. And we would do that through our preaching and through our use of the media and through advocacy and through politics in order to accomplish that goal. And so the word evangelical slightly shifted again to mean those who were supporting a particular Christianized cultural agenda. And then I think in, I don't know, the last 10 or 15 years, that's just been hyperized by social media, extensive use of television, and the success at some levels of the politicization of the processes of establishing cultural norms, so that it really does now refer to a right-wing political agenda. Now, I've covered a lot of ground there, and there is a lot there, but it's sort of like, okay, there was this thing in the Bible that we redeveloped in the 16th century. And then as the centuries passed, these additional layers of meaning get woven into it, some of which we sort of like, some of which we might change our mind about, some of which we could salvage, some of which we still want to keep, some of which we just wish would go away. And that's where we are with the term. I see you're nodding your heads. And oh, you guys are nodding your heads too. Okay, all right. Okay, so that's, now the question is, what do you do with this? Okay, and I think this is an important question for us, and I have an opinion about it, and I'll share that in a little bit, but what do we do about this? I really don't know what to do, and maybe we can just talk about that this morning using Zoom and our group here. So what should we do with the term evangelical? Should we use that word to describe ourselves? I think there are several possibilities. One on the sheet is to abandon it. Just forget about it. Don't spend any more time on it after this adult forum. We're done. And we don't need the word evangelical to describe ourselves. Just recognize that it has lost its capacity to convey its 16th century meaning, and just let it be. As the Beatles say, that's, as we get older, not a bad thing about something. And I think there's some real advantage to that. Now, the second possibility recognizes that there's some disadvantages to just letting it be, that it's probably might be at some level worth struggling for, fighting back a little bit on some things. It's to recover the word evangelical through an effort to reinterpret the term and the intent of the Reformation. After World War II, Karl Barth, Protestant theologian, not Lutheran, Reformed, developed a theology that I like in many ways. One of the points of that was the need after World War II to recover theological understanding in a way that made sense of the world after World War II had made such a mess of it. And so Barth's phrase was neo-orthodoxy, 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 new orthodoxy, returning to the classical foundations of Christian theology to make sense of the world, and recovering those terms so that we can ground ourselves again in meaning that makes sense of this horrible mess that the Second World War had made of things. So there is some value, I think, in a neo-orthodox approach. And sometimes I think that's what we should do. We should try to recover it somehow, recognizing that that might be an impossible task, but going ahead and doing that. And then the third possibility for me, and there probably are many more, but my third possibility was add another layer of meaning to the term. To just say, okay, this is one of those words where you just, as the centuries go by, you add another meaning and another layer to meaning. And so let's just sort of think a little bit about what that meaning might be, so that we are not necessarily worried about recovering the 16th century in all of its purity, but taking this word and thinking about the Lutheran faith and what it might mean for our future church. Add a fresh layer to the cake, starting our own new conversation and calling the Reformed Church to maybe a new agenda. And in this case, evangelical would mean a renewed interest in and grounding in the story of the Gospels of Jesus and the early church. That the word evangelical simply means to get into Bible study again. And it would also mean, evangelical would mean focus on how we might bring hope, just plain hope, to the simple believing heart, which is the core of this of the 16th century thing. The simple believing heart is a pretty important thing. Just bringing hope to that is what we mean by evangelical. And it would mean to lift to the surface God's global intention, that God is interested in saving the cosmos rather than individual people, or changing cultures in ways that isn't a good thing, but just rethink the global intentions of God. And an evangelical in this, adding another layer, might mean rethinking grace and salvation and God's good news for all creation in a fresh and radical way. Now, this adds another layer to the cake. It's a new vision for God's salvation of the world and all things in it. And it's very close to Ephesians, that ta panta, all things are involved in God's salvation movement. Teilhard de Chardin speaks of a movement of all creation to an omega point, where all things are returned into the waiting arms of the loving God. And all things in creation are moving along that line. That's a fresh and new way to look at salvation and the work of Christ in the world and God's love for all things. And it may be that evangelical is one of the words that is used to describe that global understanding of things. To give you some sense of how subtly important this is, I actually got to church this morning, and this morning in the prayers, we didn't say, those prayers of intercession that we always say in church. We did not say, Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. What we said was this. Blake said, gracious God, and then we read, inspire us to love the whole of creation. And then our petitions were about the salvation of the world in all of its dimensions. And a few of them were selected for this morning's attention. But our whole prayer this morning was had cosmic implications. Now, let me shift gears just a little bit. I've been reading Ilia Delio, and I really like her work. And where is she? Oh, Mary Lynn, I'm halfway through her book that you loaned me, and I'll get it back to you soon. And then you can have mine. She has 2 works out. I have one, she has the other. Anyway, Ilia Delio's work, now this is really strange, but it's fun. Her title, she's a Roman Catholic theologian, really a profound thinker, and she is a student of Teilhard de Chardin. And her title is Making All Things New, Catholicity, Cosmology, and Consciousness. It turns out, I think, that just as we Protestants have been having trouble with the word evangelism, Roman Catholics have been having trouble with the word Catholic. What does the word Catholic mean? Well, at first in the New Testament tradition, the word Catholic means universal, and then it got to mean Roman Catholic Church with all the hierarchy and the structure and all of that sort of stuff and the belief system, and this is what you have to believe, And then in the ecumenical decades of the 50s and 60s, it started to mean universal again. But I think in most of the Roman Catholic churches, it still meant Roman Catholic Church. And so it's an ambiguous term that they've really kind of struggled with. Some Roman Catholics think it means the Pope, and some of them think it means the universal church. But Delio is putting another layer of meaning on Catholic. She thinks it means all of creation, which is the church that God is trying to redeem through, in, with, and under our actions as individuals in the scheme of things, as God brings all creation, redeems all things, all creatures, and brings that back to the omega point of God. And I think that this might be another nice layer to add to the word evangelical, just as she's adding another word to a layer to the word Catholic. She does have a passage here in which she does use the word evangelism. And I just want to read these 3 or 4 sentences. And her sentences are longer than even mine, so that's good. Makes me feel better. She says, to live the good news of salvation, to evangelize, is to build one's soul by creating engagement with the world, embracing the earth with a new zest for life, uniting that which is separate, creating new wholes, and overcoming disunity through bonds of selfless love. The Christian is now discovering that she cannot be saved except through the universe and as a continuation of that universe, living from a deep center within. Christians are to go about urging all reality toward the omega, to the final synthesis that is constantly growing within them. Each person who awakens to a new consciousness of Christ's universal presence discovers his or her own self-realization and full maturity to being in Christ. It does matter what the individual human person does, for only through his or her action can one encounter God. I wonder if in this last layer of the cake, Catholic and evangelical can meet. I'll end with a story about our possible approaches. Let's say that we're a farmer that's got the horse that's been let out of the barn. The horse is out of the barn. The word evangelical is no longer in the barn. It's running around through centuries now, and we don't know what to do. One possibility is to try to catch the horse and get it back in the barn. We might not be very successful with that, but it might be worth a try. One approach is to just let the horse run around. That might be the best thing to do. Let the horse just run around and let it be. Or we may just sort of sit down and try to figure out where the horse wants to go. Where's the horse headed? And if we follow it a little bit, we may discover that our neighbor, when we didn't get along with very well, has also got a horse on the loose. They're headed the same place. And that's not a bad thing. Okay, I'm going to stop. And we have time for questions, don't we? Okay. Any comments, thoughts, observations?
This is Carolyn. I've always been curious why when the several denominations came together, that they chose to put the name that they did, that the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the ELC. I mean, they chose that, and I can't remember exactly when that happened. You may remember the years, but there must have been a reasoning.
Okay, here's my I don't know about the reasoning, but I suspect that the ELC is especially Nordic rather than German, and I think the Norwegians and the Swedes all really just as soon have the word evangelical to describe things rather than Lutheran. Yeah, I mean, they really, do we have to use the German leader's name? Can't we just have another term to describe this thing? And evangelical is really the best term that came out of the Reformation. It's a winner of a term that's just been layered over so much. Ed?
Well, way back in Duluth, when I was little, I belonged to the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church.
There you go. Now, that may have meant that they were disestablished Norwegians rather than state church Norwegians. See, we're getting back to that other layer. And many of the Norwegians who settled in this area were Haugian, the old log church down in it's off of F and X down by Blue Mound. Those Lutherans were immigrants that were a part of the Haugian movement that was very much persecuted by the state church. They didn't think that the state church was right to be established as a state church. And so we have a strong disestablishment sense to our Lutheran tradition here in southern Wisconsin still because of that. We don't like to be told what to do. And in Duluth, sometimes that word evangelical meant disestablished. We're not part of the government. We're our own faith and we stand alone. And nobody is going to tell us what to believe.
Here.
Here, yeah. Okay.
I don't know where it is. Okay. I grew up in South Minneapolis where my family, my great grandfather came from Norway to go to the seminary at Augsburg. And his branch of Lutheranism is the Norwegian Free Church.
Norwegian Free. See, there you go. Mhm. And I bet at least half of the Nordic background in Dane County is free rather than established. Mhm. And so that use of the word is the word free and evangelical, and those words, they're really important to the groups when they were establishing themselves. And they made a statement so that people knew what they were. Mhm.
What's tough now, though, is this is all interesting history and background. But when people hear the word evangelical, they think that you're a lunatic. And it's really too bad that that's the first word in our synod's name.
Yeah. Although maybe that's somewhat temporary, and by temporary I mean just a couple of decades. Because I think people are becoming so religiously illiterate that you could just about that they just hear those words and they soon mean nothing. And so maybe we should just ride that illiteracy a little bit and recover a whole new meaning for it. See, go ahead, Nancy. Nancy, you need the microphone. Oh, Susie was first. Okay.
Well, I agree. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. Jocelyn. I agree with what you said because I think we talk about this a lot, that I think when people hear the word evangelical or even just church anymore, they think televangelists and so I think adding a fresh layer and trying to go a different direction is not a bad thing, because I think there are a lot of people who just think church or evangelical and think crazy, and there's so much more to it, and there's such a more beautiful definition we know that I don't think everybody else is aware of. So I think that word does hold a lot of negative connotations to people who are illiterate, as you say, when it comes to church,
So I think I'm piggybacking on what Susie said. So how do we find a language for this new Catholicity and new evangelism at a time when I think one more layer on the first part is the co-opting of the right-wing establishment by Donald Trump? I think the the divisiveness puts a bigger challenge on how to get new meaning. And much of the churches don't have much voice these days. So how do we get a voice for this new?
Well, let me posit something really radical for an old person. Maybe it's time to just say, oh, to hell with Trump and all of that stuff. And to hell with everybody just talking about this forever. Maybe we need to immigrate. We need to leave the old world and get on the boat and go to a new world. We need to go to a new landscape, verbal landscape, where not everybody will join us and our communities will be very small, but we will rebuild in a new world, a society where we are based once again on bringing hope to the simple believing heart. And we can use the word evangelical and Catholic to mean that. And part of it is we just are so trapped by the conversation of our culture that maybe the only thing we can do is simply abandon that and just say, no, I'm not going to be a part of that anymore. I don't care about that. I'm going to a new place and establish a new thing. Now, I don't know if that's a good idea or not. But it's almost like, okay, we're a group of immigrants sitting in an old world church basement, trying to figure out whether or not we should take a boat across the ocean and start over. But we may have to do that because things are really so messed up with all these layers that it's our only hope. And I'm just really tired of all the stuff. And it just makes people angry on all sides, and everybody just keeps the chatter as high as possible. But we are completely free to establish our own religious dialogue whenever we want. We can do that. We can do that.
And as part of that process, let me remind the folks that are watching by Zoom, they can either raise their hand or use the chat to let us see what you folks are thinking so that we can share it with the group at large. So thank you.
Well, this is just an incredible topic and discussion. I'm someone who just has, from the time I was really little, just didn't understand this evangelism thing at all. And I certainly don't now. But I mean, I'd like to go someplace else, either in my mind or geographically, so to speak. But I think our responsibilities are too great in this nation at this time. And I'm too old and I'm not smart enough. But I keep coming back to this one book. It's not the only book I've read, but the one that I read in this past pandemic. And that is The Power Worshippers by Catherine Stewart. And that is it's a book that every single Lutheran pastor should be reading, and probably all Lutherans, because it is incredibly researched and it's very, very specific on how the
quote unquote fundamentalist evangelical movement in this nation has taken over, and also taken over politically. And they have moved, they have moved into the halls of government, not just in an elected way, but in a way of holding Bible studies, whether it be in the Oval Office, whether it be in the seats of government in all of the states, the idea of leasing property in the public school institutions because it saves money, and developing like youth clubs from very little children on up. I mean, I think I'd like to walk away, but I think we can't. And I think people really need to understand really what has happened and is happening. And I'm not the one who wrote the book or researched it, but it's incredibly researched. And I just feel the need to bring it up when I'm in situations where we're discussing.
And Nancy's, for everyone, just say the book again.
It's called The Power Worshippers
Mhm.
by Catherine Stewart.
Okay.
Catherine with a K and Stewart, I can't remember, STEW or ST, but it's big. It's big. So
Yeah.
I don't mean to be gloom and doom, but it was like my eyes were really opened. The what?
There's a movement, and I can't remember, Christian nationalists or something to that effect. And there's been a lot of stuff coming out about what you're saying, and I think it behooves us to learn more about what's going on as well.
How long do we go? Okay. When I talk about abandoning the site or this ground, I really appreciate that we do have responsibilities, and we have to figure out how to do those. Well, I am too. That's why we're just having an open conversation about this. I don't really know. But I do, in some ways, there is a value in moving out of trying to be participants in this messy and uncontrollable harangue that passes for contemporary public discourse, and shifting and finding a new place, a new land in which to develop a new Catholicity and a new evangelization. And I know I'm not supposed to use military metaphors. Okay, I'm just not supposed to, but I've got it now and then. I gotta break the rules now. And in Gettysburg, if you just watch the movie or study the Gettysburg thing, one of the big issues that is facing the generals on both sides is whether or not this is good ground, whether or not this is the best place for us to set up our lines and make our defense, or what we're going to do. And is this good ground for us? Is this a good? And that's often a very important military question whenever there's an upcoming battle, and you're talking about a battle. And so the question I'm beginning to think in my military metaphor is, where's the best ground to fight this battle? Do we slog it out in this contemporary mess? Do we find different ground? And if so, where is that? I don't know the answer. It's really where we are. We just don't know the answer to these questions.
Oh,
No.
No, yeah, already.
We just have one simple thing. By going in, I can't see isolating ourselves more.
Mm.
And I'm afraid that's what we'd be doing is we become more isolated in just our own little clique, so to speak. And we
Yeah.
wouldn't be doing what we are intended to do, and that is spread the good news
Mhm.
and help the world as best we can.
Mhm.
If you withdraw into yourself, you're not sharing with everybody around you. And I think that's the thing there.
Mhm.
It's not long enough. I just was wondering if we could send out an email or put an item in the newsletter with these two books, the Delio
Mhm.
book and the Stewart
Okay.
book.
Yeah.
That would be really, this is really interesting.
Mhm.
Thank you for all this preparation.
And I
So
hope you
huge.
sent, I hope everyone senses online, whatever. This is an issue that we don't have an answer for. That there are just different ways to try to figure out what to do with what we've got. And I don't know, you don't know, we just need to talk it out. And since we have a great evangelical free tradition, it should be talked out in church basements like this by people like us, just trying to figure out what's the best way to proceed. And then use that to inform our public expression and our public witness and our care for those in need in Madison and beyond. But this is really a hard thing, and there's no real answer. Yeah.
Is that what you call lead by example?
Yeah. 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 Uh-huh.
One of the things that, I went to church this morning at the early service too. And if you haven't gone, Pastor Katie makes a really good point that relates very strongly to this whole issue about the man who has so much. And it's not a question of power, it's a question of share.
Mhm.
And, if we aren't seduced by the concept of power, but by sharing, I think evangelism in that sense becomes something really powerful and able to be used to do what we hope that it can do. And we know that it can do.
Mhm.
But if we go down the road of power and force and manipulation and saying this is the way it's got to be, I suspect that we're going to continue to bang our heads against the wall.
Yeah. As we talked this morning, I'm reminded of two phrases, one Lutheran, one Catholic, that also come together as we approach this problem. One phrase is Luther's concept of the priesthood of all believers. It is in our mutual discussion where we share honestly our different perspectives that we come to the will of what is right and good. It is not, from the bureaucracy or the priesthood or the bishop. It is the priesthood of believers. It is in this conversation like we're having now that eventually the right thing will emerge. The Roman Catholic side of that is sensus fidei, the sense of the faithful. And it's about the same thing, that it's a doctrine that not everything comes from the Pope and the bishops and everything, but on many, many things, it's the sense of the faithful, the conversation of the people who take communion and their various opinions that will shape what needs to be done. And that it is wise for any hierarchy to pay attention to the sense of the faithful. And the sense of the faithful and the priesthood of all believers come together, and we start to sort out what is the best way to proceed, not knowing necessarily how that will turn out. Joe?
I think I agree with where you're going with all this, Pastor Ken, and I'm really kind of excited about a different kind of conversation, because it does strike me that the word evangelical has become such a bummer in our time in many ways, and it just doesn't work. And why do we want to be associated with that? A different kind of, the way in which the Lutherans handle the term evangelical is, as you put it a little bit ago, deeply positive. And, the message that the Reformers had, was deeply positive, and they wanted to, as you put it, share that simple hope with communities. This is kind of, to have that new conversation and to think about evangelical as the redemption of all creation, is so positive, and it puts it in a different place. And who knows how we're going to do that? I agree with that too. But the positivity of how we could reinterpret that really speaks.
Thank you. Yeah.
This is Dale Miller.
Hi,
I
Dale.
grew up in the Missouri Synod, and which normally doesn't use the word evangelical. And Sue and I transferred our membership over to the ELCA because of the non-acceptance of certain types of people in the Missouri Synod church, the church that we were attending at that time. I'm very glad we did, and I'm very glad we found Emmanuel Midville. Excuse me. Well, Emmanuel was a church we went to for a while, and now that we moved here, I'm very glad we found the church we're at now. Midville is a very good congregation, and from my point of view, and I love all the things that go on. I just wish Sue could still be a part of it.
Thank you, Dale. Yeah. It is a good congregation. Glad we found it too. Is there anything else for the common good? I'll get your book back to you, Mary Lynn. Okay.
Let's thank Ken.
Well, thank you very much. Okay. Oh,
And if you have any other ideas about how we might continue this conversation, let us know too, either through adult education or whatever. But I think we need far more people to help us as we discern what we're after.
okay. Yes.
Yeah, and again, thank you, Pastor Ken. I think this is kind of exciting in some ways. It's nice to be hopeful,
Yes.
and
Hope is hard to come by these days. Yeah.
the other thing is, since we're getting back to some terms, and next week's presenter, you've heard the term that you are the salt of the earth. Well, next week, the presenter is going to be Hillary Dugan, and she'll be talking about how in our exuberance of salt, we have been doing some things to ponds and other kinds of things. And so it's not necessarily a good thing. And so she'll be talking a little bit about her research and what she knows and where we're going with that. So too much might be too much, but hope is a good thing.